Farm Basics is brought to you by the Liberty Link trait and Liberty herbicide from Bayer. The most reliable weed management solution, Liberty Link and Liberty herbicide are the link to efficient row crop production and sustainable weed management.
As a non-farmer, you're probably familiar with what a combine is. It's one of the most basic things that we operate on the farm. But what you may not know is there are different types of corn heads out there, and today we wanted to explain what a chopping corn head is in our Farm Basics time.
Well, a combine is, of course, the machine that harvests the grain out of the field, but to do that, you have to attach a different head on the front of the combine depending on which crop you're trying to harvest. Now when it comes to corn, it presents some different challenges because you often have an 8 to 10 foot tall plant that you have to deal with just to get this one little ear off the plant. Well, hopefully it's one big ear. Anyway, you've got this great big stalk. So when farmers would go through and harvest, they'd have these great big pieces of stalk laying out in the field, and it was really tough to manage when they wanted to come through and plant. They'd have these big long pieces of stalk that'd get caught up on the planter or on a tillage tool, and they'd just end up with a mess.
Well, what farmers used to do in the old days, by old days I mean like 10 years ago, Darren, is they would go through and they'd harvest their corn, and then they'd have what we would call a chopper that would come right afterwards, and many different farmers will call it many different things, but this basically small piece of equipment would come afterwards and chop up all the stalks. So that's what we used to do, but it was a separate trip across the field. Now, that little chopping task that we had to do after harvest, they could put guys like me on it because you didn't have to have a very skilled operator or anything like that.
You didn't have to run straight or anything
That's
like
right.
that. You can go all over the place.
You just go. So anyway, it was pretty easy for farmers to do that, but obviously it's another trip across the field. Well, now with the bigger and more modern combines, they have more than enough horsepower and enough capacity in them to handle even bigger corn heads. So now they're doing this chopping right at the same time with the corn head.
Well, the other thing, Brian, is not only saving a trip across the field, but now you can actually chop the stalks before you run them over with the machine. So you end up with a field that looks pretty nice like this one. I mean, obviously on the end rows, you're going to run over some things, but out in the middle of the field, it's nice and even, and it's going to be really easy for us to work with this and plant this field next spring.
Well, when it comes to that planting it next spring thing, what ends up happening is if a farmer is going along in the spring with his planter and there are big pieces of residue, it's easy to, with the planter, get that kind of caught in the seed trench, and we call that hairpinning the residue, where basically the seed ends up dropping on top of that corn stalk that's laid over because the corn stalk doesn't properly get sliced. Well, when we chop the corn stalks in the fall with the corn head, not only do we avoid most of that hairpinning residue issue in the spring, but it also allows bacteria to much faster break down the residue that's left in the field.
Well, the other thing, Brian, you mentioned how much bigger these corn heads are getting, so they're able to harvest more rows of corn at the same time. Well, as they get great big heads, now all of a sudden road transport becomes an issue. So some of the newer corn heads now fold up. So to get a chopping corn head that does that extra job of chopping and also folding, it's pretty complex equipment, but it's something that's really been beneficial for our farm because now we can drive down the road, just fold that corn head in, so our travel width is really no wider than the combine itself.
So once again, with a great big combine, you have to have a different head on the combine depending on the type of crop that you're harvesting. And today specifically we talked about corn heads and chopping corn heads, where we can actually harvest the grain and chop the residue up immediately.
One other thing you'll be chopping up in your fields is weeds. Hopefully our weed of the week, you can just wipe it out by chopping it up. No, you're not going to get that lucky. We'll have to show you how to control it coming up later in the show.